Carter glared at Melvin, really wanting to say, "Are we on that level of familiarity?" In the whole of Southside Prison, only Luke would speak this casually to Carter. As he wasn't particularly close to his colleagues, they naturally spoke more politely to each other, and inmates stirring trouble for the sake of it wouldn't dare speak out of bounds again after getting their asses handed back to them. Only Melvin kept playing hokey-pokey along the boundary of Carter's comfort zone. Clearly, they hadn't known each other for long, but this guy spoke even more casually to him than Luke did. "Do you think that I've got a good temper?" Carter asked. "Nope," Melvin said, sincere. Carter glared at Melvin for a while. Seeing that the guy didn't seem intent on poking fun at him anymore, he brought the subject back to business. "I know Agent Guan, the one investigating your case. He believes that you were framed." "Is that so?" Melvin lowered his eyes again, immersing in his thoughts. Carter really wanted to glean what Melvin was thinking through his expressions, but he still failed to read them in the end. Melvin shouldn't have known that Carter was acquainted with Grant because after Carter changed jobs to work in the prison, he lost touch with Grant. But after receiving this new piece of information, Melvin's expression didn't flicker in the slightest, strikingly similar to a hunter lying in wait, ready to respond to any abrupt developments at any time. "Do you really intend not to see him?" Carter asked. "It's like this, Officer James." Melvin lifted his gaze, interlacing his fingers together, casually resting them on his leg. "As of now, I've no particular opinion about him." "Why?" Carter didn't get it. "What he can do is limited. I can't count on him," Melvin struck ruthlessly, knocking the nail right on the head. Carter fell silent. Melvin wasn't wrong. It didn't matter if he subjectively trusted Grant. Objectively speaking, if Grant wasn't even able to ferret out the mole in his unit, cooperating with him would only exacerbate the danger to Melvin. This they could tell from how Melvin's house was burnt down. "Then are you just going to sit here and resign yourself to your fate?" Carter moaned. "I feel that you can still fight for it." Maybe Melvin planned to move after getting out of prison, but Carter just felt that that would be wasting a whole year away, which was unlike the way Melvin did things. "It's not time yet," Melvin said. "The formation is more important than the advance." "So you're working on your formation now?" Carter's eyebrows jumped. "No," Melvin shrugged. "A loss is a loss. I'm waiting for the opening of the next game." After losing a game, not only was he not upset by it, but he was even calmly analyzing his opponent's strengths and weaknesses, preparing for the next game. The clarity of Melvin's thought processes was astounding. Carter suddenly felt like he was being unnecessarily meddlesome. Perhaps Melvin didn't even need his help in the first place, only that his curiosity still prompted him to ask. "You have clues in your hands, right?" Melvin's eyebrows relaxed, not as intensely focused as earlier, but carrying mirth in his eyes. "Officer James, are you so concerned about my business?" Got it. This guy was starting to practice Tai Chi again. It was strange. Clearly Carter hadn't known Melvin for long, yet he could tell when Melvin was willing to speak his mind, and when he was reluctant to reveal his thoughts. Such as now, once Carter mentioned the clues, he stopped answering straight, but pulled out his favorite party trick, asking back. Carter could tell almost at once that there was no point in pressing the topic, because if Melvin wasn't willing to divulge, it would be impossible for him to get to the end of it. "It doesn't have anything to do with me," said Carter. "Grant asked me for a favor, which is why I'm asking you." "Well, Officer James, it isn't as if I can't meet him once just to give you face," Melvin said. Carter was slightly surprised. After all, Melvin had only just said that it would be useless to meet Grant. He said, "For the record, I'm not involved in this. You can judge for yourself whether or not to rely on Grant." "I know," Melvin said. "Your charm isn't beguiling enough to make me lose my head, Officer James." At noon, Melvin didn't immediately make his way down to the library. Carter guessed that he should have gone to meet Grant, but another headache-inducing figure appeared in his library again, Princess. He sat at the last row of seats by the window, not a book with him, simply staring at his fingernails in boredom. Approximately 10 minutes later, Melvin came to the library. His steps paused at the sight of Princess, then went on to grab a comic book and diverted towards the first row seats instead, again chasing off the person originally seated there with his eyes. Carter got this niggling feeling that Princess wouldn't simply sit there in the library, and as facts had it, his intuition was spot on. After Melvin sat down, Princess got up and moved to the first row, lounging bonelessly in the seat next to Melvin. "Hey, handsome, we meet again." Melvin turned his head and glanced at Princess. He looked at Carter, lifting his chin towards the spot next to Carter, his eyes seeming to say, "Can I sit next to you?" It wasn't yet 2 o'clock. There were still many inmates in the library. It went without saying that it was impossible for Carter to let Melvin enter his work area. He gently shook his head. No. Princess noticed the wordless interaction between them, arching an eyebrow in interest, his scrutinizing gaze traveling back and forth between the two of them. Melvin swiftly averted his eyes, flipping open the comic book in his hands. However, at this time, Princess suddenly raised his chin and looked out of the window, then poked Melvin's arm, motioning for him to look outside at the yard. "Handsome, please watch the show." Melvin followed Princess' gaze out of the window, and on the other side, Carter also unconsciously looked over as well. From the start of summer, fewer people had headed to the yard during the afternoon break. Even so, there were still shady spots on the fringes of the yard where inmates would sporadically gather, as this was the place furthest from the prison guards. Now there were around 4 people in the yard. Carter was immediately able to spot Shay's big build among them. Shay had been in prison for over a decade and was now 38. He worked out all year round, maintaining his body well, and the bulk of his arms was a clear warning for people not to provoke him. The thug was standing in front of Shay. The thug was hunched over, trying to explain something with an anxious expression, but every time he tried to retreat, the two flanking him would jostle him back. It seems that Shay's going to make a move. When this idea was churned out of his mind, Carter glanced at the guards watching over the yard. As expected, all of them were looking elsewhere. It was apparent that Shay had notified them beforehand. Carter silently sighed in his mind. The reason why most of the prison guards would give Shay some respect, allowing him to do what he wanted, was that this guy was deserving of this respect. Shay was a complicated person. He had entered prison on death row at first, but later on, because he took the blow when an inmate had attacked a prison guard, this merit and his good conduct had reduced his sentence to life imprisonment. He was also extremely cooperative with the prison guards usually, and would even help them manage the inmates, only acting out if people messed with him first, such as right now. He suddenly kicked the thug's lower half, and the thug collapsed to the ground on the spot in pain. The thug was brought by the guards to the opposite infirmary, whereas Shay was escorted back to Block A. This show ended very quickly, spanning not more than a few minutes. Carter shifted his gaze away from the window and noticed Princess smile like the cat that ate the canary. The psychology of inmates wasn't as easy to wrangle compared to normal people. "See that, handsome?" Princess' voice cut into Carter's thoughts. Melvin didn't respond, impassively waiting for Princess to finish what he wanted to say. "If you make me unhappy," Princess' finger climbed onto Melvin's shoulder again, "my man will deal with you." Melvin swept a look at Princess' hand, then looked at Carter, pointing at Princess with his chin. The meaning in his gaze was obvious. "Didn't you say you'd cover me?" It was only then that Carter drew back from his musings over what was between Princess and Shay. He sat upright, lifting his chin slightly and calling, 1017. As soon as the words left his mouth, Princess looked over, a trace of impatience evident in his gaze, as though already predicting that Carter was about to thwart him again. "Come over." Carter ignored Princess' gaze, looking directly at Melvin. "Sit next to me." At this, all the inmates in the library looked like they had stumbled upon a good show. They simultaneously exchanged a look with the person sitting next to them, as though having bitten some big, juicy gossip. Carter knew what his actions implied, naturally. He had never poked his nose into inmates' business, but this time he chose to stand up for Melvin because he knew that superficial warnings were of no use to Princess. Only showing a firm attitude would. Under all the inmates' gazes, Melvin walked into Carter's work area. It was important to mention that the work area of the prison staff was, to inmates, a restricted area. If any inmate dared to trespass into their work area, it was possible that they would receive a beating from the baton. Melvin sat down next to Carter and swept a glance around at the inmates staring at him. Most of them had the good sense to bury their heads down and avoid provoking Melvin. Only Princess scanned them with considerable interest, a gossipy glint flashing in his eyes. "Officer James." Melvin tilted his head, going up to Carter's ear and whispering, "Am I now your man?" That Carter got Melvin to sit next to him did give off a little of the impression that he was swearing sovereignty over him, but this was only a stopgap measure. He couldn't drive Princess from the library every time. Princess had to retreat of his own volition. Carter kept facing forward, his eyes flickering to look at Melvin askance, and he said in a businesslike manner, "You're the warden's man." It wasn't a secret among the prison staff that the warden had gotten Carter to read to Melvin. That Melvin could start afternoon labor half an hour late every day, also that guards would help him send the strawberry jam to the mailroom, was all out of the respect they paid the warden in accordance to his standing. While it wasn't that no inmates knew of this, as the number was few, Carter had deliberately said that Melvin was the warden's man to warn Princess that it was inadvisable to lay hands on Melvin. However, discrepancies were easily formed in the propagation of information. It was human nature to want to hear juicier stories. As the gossip continued to fester nonstop, even people who had inside details started to believe that there was some kind of hush-hush deal going on between Carter and Melvin. "Do you know what those inmates are saying about you?" Carter was called over by Luke to the infirmary. He had assumed at first that it was for the usual chat over a smoke, but little did he expect that as soon as he stepped in, he would get his ears nagged off by Luke. "It's Melvin's misfortune if Princess has set his target on him, but no matter what, it isn't your duty to step in." Carter disinterestedly walked towards the balcony, taking out a cigarette and lighting it, exhaling a puff of smoke. "If that's the case, then Melvin meeting me is his fortune." "Officer James," a head poked out from behind the computer, "did you really take a fancy to Melvin?" If it weren't for Gavin babbling this gossip into Luke's ears, Luke wouldn't have known that Carter had publicly backed Melvin in the library. "Why are you here again?" Carter asked. Normally, when Luke had something he wanted to talk to Carter about, he would go directly to the library. Carter had mistaken this call over to the infirmary to be for a casual smoke because he hadn't taken into account that Gavin was over here, as such forcing Luke to stay in the infirmary and keep an eye on him. "I've got a migraine," Gavin snickered. "Came over to get medicine." What migraine was he going on about? It was obviously just an excuse to pass time in the infirmary. Carter didn't answer, shifting his gaze outside the window, wanting to drop the subject of Melvin. But Luke didn't let him get away, picking up what Gavin started. "Did he really catch your eye?" "There's no such thing," Carter said, exasperated. In actuality, he could tell Luke that Melvin was framed, but if he said so at a moment like this, Luke would just think that he was being obstinate and head over heels in love with Melvin. He could also explain the ins and outs of it, how Melvin was his neighbor and he had by chance witnessed Melvin being attacked by the man in black, as well as where Grant fell in the picture. But God knows how much he'd have to talk to get this across. Also, that he didn't come clean to Luke about Melvin being his neighbor from the start was equivalent to having missed a prime opportunity to do so. Now, Luke would only focus on why hadn't he said so earlier and instead feel that he really was hiding something. As for why Carter hadn't said so earlier, it was simple. Melvin was the object of his voyeurism. It went naturally that he didn't want to expose the relationship between the two of them. Carter didn't expect that just because he gave Melvin a leg up, those inmates with nothing to do but spout bull would morph the story into such. The emergence of such rumors was normal, like how the lower dregs of males would fabricate stories about single beautiful women from thin air. Those inmates without a moral bottom line would also mold Carter into their ideal type. But that wasn't who Carter was. The ones who tried to hit on him would get a taste of suffering, and over time, those rumors stopped spreading. Consequently, now that Carter gave Melvin special treatment, those oppressed seemed to have found evidence to latch onto. The rumors that had disappeared now resurged with a vengeance. even with a bit more credibility than before. "They can try," Carter smoked, saying nonchalantly to Gavin, "I still believe in Officer James." Gavin playfully saluted Carter, then continued clacking noisily on the keyboard again. "Tell me why, though," Luke said to Carter. "It isn't your business in the first place. Why did you have to stand up for Melvin? It was a passing impulse, okay?" It wasn't an answer as flippant as it sounded. In retrospect, it did seem to be a moment of hot-headedness for him. It seriously irked his eyes to see Princess constantly plastering himself to Melvin's side. "I knew it." "You're acting weird." Luke crossed his arms in front of his chest, sighing. "Have you been single for too long? Do you want me to introduce you to a tennis coach?" As expected of his ex-boyfriend, Luke had a perfect grasp of his tastes. The lawyer the last time belonged to the competent type, and the tennis coach this time belonged to the fit type, both of which were the sort that Carter liked. "Are you going to change professions to become a matchmaker?" Carter said indifferently. "You're even more annoying than my relatives." "Do your relatives know your tastes as well as I do?" Luke said. Carter knew that Luke was only doing this out of concern, afraid that he would be brought astray. However, he didn't need Luke's worry. Comparatively, that brat Gavin was clearly more worrisome. At the thought of this, Carter raised his chin pointedly towards Gavin, saying, "What's he doing? He's typing on the keyboard so fiercely." The infirmary was entirely filled by the clickety-clackety sounds of the keyboard. Luke seemed to suddenly notice this as well, walking over to the computer to take a look. Immediately, he frowned, tugging Gavin up by the back of his collar. "Kid, are you up to something bad again?" "I'm not." Gavin stretched out his arms, struggling to reach the keyboard. "I'm right about to succeed." "Succeed in?" Carter put out his cigarette and walked over in curiosity. "I've narrowed down the God of Go's IP address. It's right in our area," Gavin excitedly said. "Just give me a bit more time. I'll definitely pinpoint his exact location." "Do you have nothing better to do?" Luke said, nursing a headache. "And even if you find him, so what? You're in prison now. Are you going to get your idol to drop by for a visit?" "This isn't just about me." Gavin spoke firmly. "Something must have happened to the God of Go. His recent IP address is different from before. I just need to find out where he is, then I can leave the follow-up to others on the forum." "Follow-up?" Luke knocked the back of Gavin's head, turning off the display monitor of the computer. "Just do your time in prison. Don't give me any trouble." Gavin covered the back of his head, pouting like a fish. "Dr. Luo is really fierce." "I can be even fiercer. Do you want to try me?" Gavin didn't make a peep, protesting with his eyes. Once again feeling a little extra, Carter bid Luke goodbye and went back to the library. Princess returned to the library in the afternoon. Carter believed that Princess had heard his sentence of how Melvin was the warden's and thought that Princess would draw back his swords a little. And while Princess was more restrained than before, no longer dropping handsome with every sentence, he took to staring provocatively at Carter. As Princess wasn't disturbing anyone, Carter didn't have any opportunity to tell him off. Moreover, the rumors about him and Melvin had spread like wildfire through the prison, so he couldn't get Melvin to sit next to him again. He stared back apathetically. Melvin's eyes were steadfastly fixed on the comic book, but his brows were tightly furrowed and his frustration was plainly visible from his face. The more Carter watched it, the greater his ire grew. But just as he was about to speak up to stop Princess, Melvin, who had stayed silent all this while, suddenly stood up, looking disdainfully down at Princess. "Let's step out for a bit." Princess cocked his eyebrows in surprise, interest pooling deep in his eyes. Carter immediately perceived that Melvin was going to deal with Princess himself, but how was he going to resolve this? Shay had kicked that thug in the testicles, sending him to an external hospital for medical attention. If Melvin were really to make a move against Princess, Carter didn't dare to imagine what Shay would do in retribution. The two of them left from the library's front door, and Melvin turned directly towards the recreation room. Carter hurriedly opened the surveillance he had on the recreation room, taking out his wireless earphones and wearing them. The interface first showed several inmates playing cards inside, but upon seeing Melvin and Princess, they naturally gave up the space, not even daring to eavesdrop outside. "What the hell do you want?" Melvin was facing the surveillance. Carter could clearly read the impatience in his expression. "What else can it be?" Princess walked up to Melvin and laid a hand on his chest. "I want to taste you." Carter's grip tightened around the mouse, trying to suppress the rage that billowed in his heart. Even if there wasn't any kind of special relationship between Melvin and him, nor could they even be termed friends, Carter had already made clear that he was covering Melvin. Yet Princess still made such overt moves on Melvin, clearly not taking him seriously at all. He reckoned that Melvin would push Princess away, but at this time, a shocking development appeared on the interface. Melvin gestured downwards with his chin, his eyes hooded as he told Princess, "Sure, come on then." Princess laughed cheekily and got to his knees in front of Melvin. Immediately, Carter's eyes widened and his breathing caught in his throat. But at this time, Melvin lifted his gaze all of a sudden, looking straight at the pinhole camera. He mouthed to Carter, seated behind the screen, "Come over,